Good morning. This is session 6 in our Essential Skills Insights series, kindly powered by Flowgas. This session is on remote management, leading teams in a virtual world, and it will be presented by Kieran O'Reilly and John Kenna. So remember, you can record this as in CPD, so you can do that in your My CPD section on your profile. So before I hand over to Kieran and John, I'd like to go through some housekeeping. So I hope you can hear and see us. Find the chat function and the Q&A function, and feel free to enter Q&A throughout the presentation, which will come through at the end. So just on the next slide then, just again to remind you, there'll be a 15-minute Q&A at the end, so use the Q&A function to interact with us this morning. If you have any technical difficulties, use the chat function or call the team on 01 665 1305. And you'll be redirected to an online survey at the end, and we'd really appreciate your feedback. So now it's my pleasure to hand over to Kieran and John. Thank you.
Good morning. Thanks very much indeed, Elva and Quiva. And on behalf of myself and John, delighted to have this opportunity to talk with you. And really what we'd love to do is myself and John work in an organization where we actually help organizations upskill for the latest challenges in terms of people management in organizations. And this whole theme of remote management has really come to the fore because of the whole pandemic. Remote management is nothing new, but it's been accelerated dramatically in the last year, as we all know. And it has brought an awful lot of new thinking in terms of how we might do this. So over the next 45 minutes to 50 minutes in the questions and answers, there's probably 3 things I want to try and cover off in this session. Very much some of the driving forces towards remote management. What are some of the driving forces both for and against remote management, and the challenges and the dilemmas that's presenting for organizations to actually adapt and deal with those driving forces. And probably the most important thing, though, is the new skills that will be required to manage teams dealing with remote workforces in that regard. Some of the ways we're going to have to change and upskill to be able to deal with remote workforces in that regard. And again, very conscious in an engineering and a technical context, this presents additional challenges. We've got many roles and many functions where remote management may not be appropriate, or it presents new problems in terms of how we do that. So that's what we hope to cover over the next. We will not be able to go into massive depth, but you'll get good an understanding of the broad issues and what's happening to try and tackle some of those issues. So really, probably the best place to start off is this whole concept of remote management. You know, what you consider as being an idealized view of what remote management looked like. I just want to imagine, some of us may have this fantasy that remote management might be where we can actually sit on the beach in a nice warm climate and watch the money coming in, or do the process changes on a factory a million miles away. What I want to do though is I want to get a sense from you, first of all, your views on what you ideally would like to see happening in terms of remote management as and when those of you are coming back into the office. To do that, I'm going to share with you a poll. And hopefully, I just want you to select what you think is what you would like to see happening where it is practical to do so. So I'm launching the poll there, and hopefully you have a chance to do that. And while you're having a look at that poll, and I'll certainly share the results of this poll with you, it's the kind of thing you think in terms of, yeah, well, here's what I would like personally, but we will have to also discuss in terms of, well, what's going to work for organizations. So we're getting some great results already, and a good mix of results. So wow, we're halfway through. I'm going to let this go because it's going to be quite interesting. And the reality is, guys, every one of your organizations, you're going to see polls like this coming up from within your organization, from within the industry, really trying to highlight the fresh thinking around how do we deal with this. So I'm going to close off that poll now in a minute or two. I've got about 80% complete. That's probably good enough for the purpose of today. I'll give it a chance, and then I'll share those results. Okay, guys, I'm going to share the results now at this stage, okay? Let's have a look. Share the results. Interesting, isn't it? About 10% would like to get back into the office full time. sometimes a lot of us are kind of fed up working at home, to be honest with you as well. Um, Mostly back in the office, but option to work remotely. Yeah, a lot of people would like that freedom to get out of the office from time to time, have that flexibility. The interesting one that's coming up very high there is mostly we work remotely from home and occasionally office, where I'm dipping into the office as needed. That's coming out by far the highest percentage here. And it's interesting, a small percentage would like to work from home remotely all the time. So, this is no big shock or surprise. And there's a lot of these results going on, and I wanted to share with you some of the other surveys and what people are saying. I actually lifted this particular survey from LinkedIn very recently. There's a guy called Chris Hurd, and he has a company called First Base HQ based out of New York. Now, he has an agenda here, obviously. His business is all about setting up businesses and organizations to be able to remotely work. So he did an online poll, though, but the results were kind of interesting, and they kind of echo what you just said. So, his survey of 25,000 responses suggests about 4% want to go back to the office full time. But others have this idea in terms of whether it be 1 day remote or 2 days remote or 3 days remote. It's a good mix of people there. Yeah, we want some element of a blended approach. Interestingly, in this particular survey, a much higher response in terms of I want to work remotely all the time. We didn't see that in our little survey. But here's the point. 69% want remote working the majority of the time, and how we might achieve that. And what's really much more concerning is 96% don't want to go back full time. Interestingly, there was actually a survey done in Ireland, sponsored by the Irish government, done through researchers in National University of Galway, where they're looking at the numbers in Ireland were showing about 94% who have now gotten used to working from home would prefer not to go back full time. This poses some real questions. So that's a massive driving force, massive change in the last year, this desire to change how we work, where practical, and that is the big dilemma. This does cause some serious dilemmas for us as organizations, as managers and teams that are working. How do we get that balance right? What is the new formula? Is there a perfect solution? Or as you can probably see, it's all going to depend. It all depends on the nature of the organization, the nature of the work that has to be done. But this is the real challenge, though. Whatever solution we finalize on for each type of organization, what are the new expectations and how do we adapt to those expectations? Because things have changed dramatically in terms of what people expect and what they are hoping for as they return to the workforce. And this also presents some new risks for businesses. How are we going to mitigate those risks and actually try to work around some of the challenges presented by remote working? And probably the most important one here that myself and John talk about a lot, because this is the field we work in. What are the new skills managers are going to need to actually deal in this remote world? Because it's a very different game in that regard. And probably best to start off by saying remote working is nothing new. It just became a lot more prominent in the last year. And let's just look at the reality of remote working. Many of us in organizations we're dealing with, whether in the civil or engineering services, we're well used to this concept of remote management. We have colleagues and employees deployed on projects at client sites, not just around Ireland, but globally, where we've learning and are learning to find ways to actually manage people remotely. I've really enjoyed working with a fairly significant operation down in Cork, where they do provide engineering services to people globally. And I've been really delighted to work with them in terms of how they are adapting and coping to managing their people remotely. Many of their people, they only might see once or twice a year. And it's a question, how do you be effective in leading and managing those folks? It does require new skills and new ways of thinking. But there are other types of companies, and what I would call let's say the new generation companies, where they have a radically different mindset to remote working. And they have this what they call anytime, anywhere mentality to working. And many of us are used to this being on the road anyway. I'm actually working with one guy at the moment. The chief executive has the company based in San Francisco, but he's got resources in rural Cavan, Dublin, Argentina, Southeast Asia, some of who have never actually physically met. Now, it's an IT services company, but I'm working with him to ensure you need to adapt your style and management skills for a virtual remote world. And I suppose what a lot of us now looking at remote working is the experience of working from home. So remote working has a broader meaning, but for many of us in the last year, we're thinking in terms of working from home. And that's where the big change came. The huge amount of us that had to, without choice, work from home on the request of our government and the health authorities. So let's just talk about what's changed in terms of remote management. Before pandemic, it was primarily certain types of businesses. You know, it's typically a lot of the IT businesses could allow a certain amount of remote working, or where we had embedded resources at client sites, or we had global operations where we were putting people out as a secondment or an assignment. And so it would be a relatively smaller proportion of the workforce. And let's say it was cautious adoption of remote management. And while there may have been demands for it and calls for it, most organizations were, let's say, let's think about this and let's do it in a very measured and careful way, because there were concerns about how effective this would be and some of the issues that raised. Unfortunately, the pandemic era changed that dramatically. It was a massive shift to forced adoption of remote management for many in the workforce. If you were not a frontline worker in a role that critically required you to be physically present, we were asked to work from home. And that meant very rapid adaptation. Myself and John have been working with companies through this where they've had to radically change how to do things in a way they never anticipated. Very limited planning, very limited preparation. And it was a case of making do. It was very much a leap of faith and hope for the best. And it involved a large proportion of our workforce. And a lot of us now are starting to talk about this as the new normal. And we keep hearing that buzzword over the last year, this is the new normal. Question is, though, what's the next normal? Because what we don't know is what it's going to be like post-pandemic. I don't think it'll be exactly as it is during the pandemic era, and it probably won't be as it was pre-pandemic. Post-pandemic, the view is it's going to be a lot more considered, a lot more thought through, and where we'll have time to adapt and adopt. And that's what organizations are doing right now. They're trying to figure out, how do we get this right? How do we plan for it and prepare for it? Because it will likely involve a significant larger proportion of the workforce. And this is what we might call the next normal. And guess what? Every organization is going to have a different definition of the next normal. There's not going to be one definition. So there's some of the forces at play, but here's something, the government hasn't been totally quiet on this. John, I'm going to ask you to talk about what the government has been doing in this particular area.
Yeah, Kieran, so it's a well-known fact that the government published a strategy in January of this year around remote working. The strategy is actually called Making Remote Work, okay? And it's built on kind of three pillars. One is around the environment for remote working, the infrastructure around it, and then kind of a guidance framework around it. But really what we're hitting on today is the underpinning conditions and around skills, etc. Right? So, you know, it's recognizing that is going to be a permanent feature. And it's interesting in this new strategy, there's going to be a right to request. And this is something we have to look to the future in terms of this right to request process. I mean, it's interesting, it's underpinned by some of those surveys you talked about earlier in the slide. I mean, about 50% of companies surveyed do not have a policy in this area on remote working. So, you know, and you know, it's interesting looking at your last slide, it's that forced adoption thing. And now we have to go back and look at policies, etc. But specifically where you're coming from in your presentation this morning is the skills requirements they've identified around the areas of management. Leading remote teams is another theme. and the culture change that created with remote working. And some of the issues that they talk about under these pillars here is this, and I know you're going to go into this in a bit of detail, so remote working versus the social connection, and also collaboration and communication needs of employees, right? Yeah. And it's interesting, when I was looking at it and preparing, working with you on this, they talk about the right to disconnect and how we manage that, right? So schedules and times, etc. So I don't want to go into it in any detail, but everybody on the webinar needs to understand that this strategy does exist. If you get a chance to have a look at it, it's called Making Remote Work.
Yeah, and to be fair, I mean, they've done a good job laying out here. It's not all one-way traffic here. There's an understanding that this is complex and it is fraught with dilemmas in that regard, but it's coming. and we have to figure out what's the best version of this. So I think we're going to hear a lot more about this in the coming times, and certainly we will delve into this a lot more later on.
Yeah, but even if you look at our experience of years 20 and 21, most of our offerings now are including modules on remote management. So it certainly is a trend. Yeah.
And I think that for me was the big takeaway. Myself and John discussed this. It's how do we upskill managers to be able to deal with this new reality? It is a shift in thinking, all right? And there's a very shift. And that's a theme that I want to carry through for the rest of this workshop in terms of what does this mean in terms of us as managers or as team members or team leads? How does that going to affect us? Probably though, I want to kind of start off those, this whole idea, remote management for a lot of people is synonymous with working from home. But as we already mentioned, a lot of people are doing remote management, remote working already, but the working from home has changed everybody's perspective on this. And we all know the massive amount of positives that people are seeing about it. There's lots of anecdotal evidence. Lots of people, you see the benefits, those who've had to work from home, the things you like. And, a lot of these are things like, reducing the whole commute. And it's interesting, the government policy recognizes, wow, that's a big part of their strategy to try and reduce commuting times. A lot of people are starting to realize the whole experiment of the open office plan. People now kind of, I enjoy the privacy of being able to work and get my head down without interruption and disturbance. It allows me to focus on work. Here's the real challenge in terms of talent management. The last year has got a lot of people to totally reevaluate their career priorities. What's important? I think we've all gotten very philosophical about what we want from our career and our life. And that's going to present some challenges in terms of the mix in the workforce. Lots of questions around the technology support. How can I set up my home operation? Am I working in the kitchen? With kids running around, the dog in and out the door, partners coming and going, trying to make the cups of tea, have lunch, or have I got a dedicated home office environment? These are some of the real issues that are starting to come up in home working.
Kieran, in that strategy, actually, to talk about the broadband rollout plan, because it has to underpin this, of course.
And there you go. And are we ready yet for that? That's probably the big question. Yeah. And flexibility is starting to come up as a big issue in terms of what is this a 8:30 to 4:30 day, or the whole new challenge around defining working hours and establishing clear boundaries, as John mentioned there, in terms of there probably will be legislation to say we need to respect those boundaries. Right now, the perception is not much boundaries happening, and not because we as managers may have been imposing it, but people are finding it hard to set those boundaries. And it has raised this whole idea of what do we call productivity? Is it output or hours? And it's really brought that whole conversation to a head. So here's the problem. Work from home. While we see all the positives and we can all see the good related to it, it has presented some negatives. And we're starting to see some of those negatives coming through and the experiences that some people are having with that. And on top of that, we're starting to find some of the unintended consequences of remote management and working from home. And has raised questions about how do we mitigate against these? Let's just look at that a little bit further, a little bit more closely. This has changed workforce expectations. It is all about how have I got the right setup in terms of office furniture, seating, technology, broadband connection, even the laptop, people hunched over laptops in on kitchen counters, all those ergonomic issues you can control in the workplace. What can you actually control in the home operation? Because this is one of the things that's coming out from a legalistic point of view. We still have a duty of care to our employees, even if they're working from home. And that has created whole challenges in terms of, are you set up in a safe manner? And we've kind of fudged it in the last year because we had to. But these things are going to get tidied up. It has raised whole questions about childcare issues. Not a big concern for myself and my partner, where our kids are growing up. Next door, there's 2 young professionals with 3 kids. It's been hell for them in terms of trying to get that balance right. Employment legislation issues, they're going to come to the fore. You know, what are the rights? What are the issues around managing resources and how people are operating? One of the really interesting issues that popped out is what they call jurisdictional issues. So if I want to work from home, could I have my home in the Canaries and do my work from the Canary Islands? In theory, technically possible, but it raises whole questions over, employment legislation, even tax implications, etc. Quite a complex situation. And it's already throwing up issues in terms of people who have moved around in a global workforce. In addition, we start to think about onboarding. If I'm a new employee, what's my experience going to be joining a company? It's kind of fine for folks of John and my age, where we've developed our social networks and organizations. But if you're joining a workforce, you're at a huge disadvantage if you haven't met with your colleagues. And I think we've all come across stories of friends with young entrants to the workforce where they've never met their colleagues face to face. And that creates this whole issue of integration and socialization. Are we creating a new generation gap in terms of that connection with the organization? It raises challenges around professional development. We are doing our best through workshops like this and webinars, and Engineers Ireland are doing a terrific job. But now we're going to miss that day-to-day contact that might happen naturally in the office environment if we're not careful. It's raised massive concerns around progression. If I'm working from home and John is working in the office, does that mean John has a better chance of being promoted and progressed? Am I at a disadvantage? So these are fundamental questions. And hopefully I've provoked you a little bit to think, because what I'd like you to do is to think about what other factors from an organizational point of view are at risk here as we go to remote working. It's not to say we will not be going to remote working, but what's at risk? So what I'd like you to do is put into the chat function your thoughts. What are some of the risks? What are some of the consequences of you and your colleagues working remotely? Because there are. And again, if we see some stuff coming through the chat there, I'd like that either John, Elva, or Creevy, if you see something coming through there, we might take this on board, because this is part of the reality check. How do we mitigate for these differences or concerns in that regard? So if you have thoughts on that, maybe 1 or 2 items coming through. Okay, well, I'll tell you what, the chat function may not be fully working. We lose the
Kieran, just, yeah, they've
it's coming now.
Coming through now. So lack of collaboration.
Yeah.
Mentoring, trust.
Yeah.
Colleagues not being readily available when needed. Unutilized office space. Jobs moving to other jurisdictions and long term if they can be done remotely.
Yeah.
We lose the off the record water cooler moments where a lot of good conversations take place.
Yeah.
Burnout, no demarcation between home and office. The social aspect, peer-on-peer interaction more difficult. Promotion opportunities. Difficulty in communicating clearly. So yeah, misunderstanding of views and remarks, misrepresentation. Graduate development, innovation. So lots coming in. Isolation. Building rapport between team members and managers. They lose out on team bonding. Drive down of salaries to lowest country levels, to match lower country levels. mentoring, developing more junior staff. So lots
Wow.
there. I hope I covered them all.
We've opened up the floodgate there, I think. And every one of those is very relevant in terms of there are some serious concerns, both as an employee, but even from an organizational point of view, in terms of if I was a senior manager or the chief executive, I'd be worried about some of these things as well. The impact to the business as much as the impact to the individual. So there are some serious challenges there, guys, and we'll certainly try and capture these. But, you know, myself and John thought about some of these here, you know, and a lot of that I think I've actually connected in what we just said here. There's massive concern about this whole idea of connectedness. And a lot of people talk about this lack of connection over the last year. And that's what we are really missing in that regard. That idea of connectedness. And it's almost we want to rush into the office just for the day, just to say hello. That feeling connected again. And it's interesting, for years you heard your colleagues and human resources talk about driving this whole engagement concept. How do you engage the workforce to feel engaged in what they're doing? A lot more difficult to drive engagement through virtual means. And probably the one that's really the biggest concern, and it's kind of highlighted by the comments you guys are making, this whole idea of the corporate culture. We've heard so much about the culture of an organization is so critical. And there's so much being done to try to improve the corporate culture. How has that been impacted by remote working? Hard to protect that culture in that kind of situation. It's interesting, you guys talked about collaboration. That's probably the biggest anxiety or concern about, you know, how do we compensate and mitigate for the loss of collaborative thinking? Or what's really interesting talking to some of our clients is they're seeing a rise in what they call silo mentality. So on their Microsoft Teams, maybe the immediate team is staying connected, but the interactions between functions is missing because you don't have those ad hoc meetings in the corridor. John and I, we work for a very large organization. We won't mention them, but they're seeing this big time in their head office. Do you remember the corporate offices, John, where they really talked about this loss of connection between departments? And they were really worried about this.
It's interesting, Kieran, because in this government strategy document, they talk about creating remote working hubs around the country as an option, right? You're talking about connectedness, collaboration. They're talking about creating hubs around the number of counties, right, where people can go to.
Yeah, and there are solutions, and that's what we're definitely coming to that, because there are some creative solutions here to this. But this is probably the one, from an engineering point of view, it's the whole area of innovation and collaborative idea development. You can do it to a point, but nowhere near as rich as live. And that's the challenge. And we're also seeing, and I think you guys are seeing here, there's a risk of burnout because we haven't done a good job of defining boundaries. And that's as much of the challenge for employees as it is for management, trying to figure out that model to get it right. This is all about well-being in a way we never anticipated 2 or 3 years ago. It's a whole new approach, new thinking around team well-being in that regard. Here's one that kind of got a bit surprising. I was working with one client in a pharmaceutical company, a coaching client, and he was a fairly senior director in the organization, where he talked about conflict. People are getting tetchier on technology. They're tired. Looking at Zoom all day long or Microsoft Teams, that there are some new interpersonal challenges. The relationships are not as warm or not as connected. People are getting tetchy. That's something we probably wouldn't have predicted in that regard. It does raise the whole question, because I think what we've realized is that to be effective as an organization in engineering or any area of enterprise, it's about communication. Communication is at the heart of how we get things done. And yet remote working does present some new challenges. One of the things myself and John are really passionate about and really interested in, in terms of what we call communication richness. And if we start at the bottom of the pile in terms of we're so over dependent on things like email and texting and all that, the written communication. But we all know the risks associated with that. It is not really great communication. It is It is broadcasting, a bit like this webinar today. Okay. And we're all getting used to these tools like WhatsApps for, Twitter type tools are being used in organizations. Again, a very dynamic, it's a step improvement over email where it's somewhat real-time communication, but it's still written. And we're getting none of the body or the facial recognition in regard. Audio is a step improvement, okay, because it allows for real conversations. And we've been using that. We're well used to that in terms of having a good telephone conversation. I have concerns about audio on these internet setups because it's not full duplex. A lot of you guys are very familiar. On a phone, you can have real conversations. The multiplex calls. On the internet, these tools, where all these awkward gaps and when do I talk and when do I stop? It's not as natural, and that affects the richness. Video calls, we've got so used in the last year. I remember years ago, it was all about Skype. Now we've a myriad of new tools. And still people find it's difficult, and we do get tired. And it's a whole new skill in terms of using technology and actually getting the best from it. And still we have folks who may be reluctant to use video, and so we lose that richness. There is nothing like face-to-face for richness of communication. Having said that, it doesn't mean to say we cannot use remote management and get better at some of those other tools, but we may need to compensate for it and learn new skills in using those tools. And there's a lot of things we can do. Another area myself and John are very interested in is recognizing that not everybody's experience of remote working is the same. Not everybody's experience of working from home is the same. And one thing we're fascinated and interested in is the whole area of different personality types. And many of you have worked in organizations where you've done these kind of tests, whether it be Myers-Briggs or Insights or whatever. But I want you to think about two particular parts and the differences in types of people in organizations. Jung talked about introverted and extroverted preference. And here's the situation. Those with an introverted preference, guess what? Work from home works quite well. I'm quite happy to work on my own without distraction and just get my head down and keep focused on the job done. So a lot of people with their introversion preference are kind of saying, yeah, I kind of like this work from home. It suits me. On the other hand, those with a natural extroversion preference said, yeah, I can do it, but I'm missing the stimulation. I'm missing the interaction big time. And this really shows the different experience people are having of remote working or working from home. It can really depend on some of your preferences. Likewise, for those who are familiar with Jung's theory, they're talking about those who have a thinking preference and a feeling preference. Very much those with the thinking preference feel, yeah, working from home, working remotely, it's just about allowing the space, do the work, focus on the task, no interruptions, just deliver on results. Those that feeling preference, they're feeling that loss of connection while doing that. They're feeling that loss of connection with the culture of the organization. So it's a fairly complex and diverse experience of remote working, and we need to factor that in terms of how we manage. This is not one solution fits all. We need to be mindful of that. Those with that introverted thinking preference, we can get lost in the detail. We can get lost in the task and forget the connection to the organization. Those with that thinking extroversion, there's probably a feeling that we're losing control. We don't know what our people are doing. Can I trust them to do the job? Those with the introverted feeling preference, it's getting disheartened. I don't really feel part of the organization anymore. I don't feel connected. I'm losing that sense of the culture I belong to. And those that feeling extroversion, they're missing that whole collaborative approach to getting things done. So you can see it's a fairly complex mix of reactions, and we are different. We are not experiencing things the same. You keep hearing this expression, we're all in the same boat or even the same storm. No, the reality is we're all equipped to deal with these changes differently. And that's something myself and John are really curious about. So what does this
Kieran,
mean?
then if you,
Sorry, John.
if you go and overlay this then with management types, personalities of managers,
Oh,
right? And I know you'll expand on that later when we do the program, but that's where it gets very interesting.
Oh, absolutely. When there's a clash in terms of if your management style is one and your employees are other, that's where it's going to get really interesting. And it kind of leads that into what's going to be required of leaders in the virtual world. There's going to be different skill sets required. Ironically, just before the pandemic, Capgemini, a major consultancy, talked about the requirement to build up our emotional intelligence in the age of artificial intelligence. And I think the pandemic and the future is going to be a lot more automation, a lot more artificial intelligence. And that means as leaders, we need to compensate for that with emotional intelligence. And I'm not going through all that, but you can see the types of skills that we're looking to become better at as leaders in this remote world. So myself and John, we talk a lot about emotional intelligence. And I'm thinking now the last year has brought out this idea that we need an enhanced version of emotional intelligence in a virtual world. I don't know whether you want to call it digital emotional intelligence, but it's an amplified version. Because if anything, in a remote managed environment, we have a task and people balance normally. We really probably need to get really good at the people part to be enabled the task part. This is probably what's going to get amplified. One particular model I'm a big fan of is this Genesis model, where we talk about how do we really get better at self-awareness and awareness of others, picking up on those differences in terms of how we cope with remote management. It's a time where we're going to have to get a lot more authentic. Really interesting that you guys talked about trust is one of the things that we're going to lose. That's the area where it's going to be the hardest thing to develop, is the trust and honest dialogue in a virtual world. And it's about balancing the head and the heart in how we communicate and make decisions. It's really going to put a lot of pressure on us as leaders and team leaders and managers in terms of our demeanor, how we come across, how we show up. And how will I know if all I see is an icon rather than a visual? It is more about how we actually create that environment where we are making people feel they can get on with their job. I believe it's going to be a huge shift in the style and approach to actually leading and managing people in a virtual world. So let's look then, what are the big tech companies doing? So all of the organizations, we're all scrambling, and it's interesting what John said. Lots of companies, I really haven't addressed this fully yet. It's a wait and see. What are other people doing? But I'm afraid it's probably now we need to start planning ahead. Interestingly, organizations like Facebook and Twitter and Shopify, who all have operations now, they're kind of going for it. They're saying, and the nature of their work is probably they can do so, but they're looking at a work from home permanently wherever practical. Now, they'll have to come up with some creative solutions, as John was mentioned, in terms of dealing with collaboration and culture and all that. It'll be very interesting how they work through this. One organization you're probably reading a lot about is how Google are adapting to this. They are taking a very different approach and probably slightly more cautious approach globally. It's going to be work from home until at least September. They've pushed that date out a few times, but they're saying now it's going to be at least September. And then they're going to trial something. What they're going to go for is what they call the flexible work week, where there will be 3 days in the office. And they're also going to have what they call collaboration days, where you will be there for those days, where we try to encourage that collaboration. And they're going to run that as an experiment to see, will that compensate for some of the things we talked about here? So you can see every organization is going to have to find their sweet spot in this. There is no one magic formula, but we're going to have to factor in these dilemmas and challenges in that regard. So from a management point of view, what we see, there's a few things now we want to be able to go into a lot deeper, but it's beyond the scope of today. And certainly I know Queeve is going to talk about a one-day program where we're going to delve into this a little bit deeper. But certainly some of the themes that are really pertinent into talking about how we lead and manage remotely is defining what is the next normal for your organization, because it's going to be different for our other organizations. So it has been a very clear picture of what that next normal is going to be, and the fact that it might continue to evolve. I don't think it's going to be set in stone. I think it's going to evolve based on what we've learned in the last year. A big part of remote management is understanding the different experiences. We've talked about that in the last few minutes in terms of people have different experiences. We as managers, if we're honest, have different experiences. And I've talked to some senior executives, even owners of organizations, where they've never been as stressed in all their life trying to deal with this. It's been one of the most stressful years in terms of trying to make this work without any clear visibility of the end point. And I suppose the next file is about learning how to lead in that next normal. And we're going to talk about some of those skill sets. Probably what you're getting though here, and it's kind of tied in with team dynamics and team culture. And it's more about team health. And I just don't mean the mental health or the physical health, but it's the health of the teamwork that we may have been losing a little bit. How do we protect it, compensate for it, drive it so that the team dynamic is as strong as can be? Probably the biggest challenge a lot of people are thinking about, and there's a lot of fresh thinking in this area, is how do you actually manage performance in a virtual world? The game is changing, and we're going to have to change very radically in terms of how we look at managing performance. That was already a journey that had started about 4 or 5 years ago, but I think it's going to accelerate in terms of how we actually manage performance in a virtual world. Some of the techniques that were popular a few years ago may have to be adapted and broken down and redesigned for the future. Apart from all of that, there is a whole question of the practical skills, the day-to-day mundane things. Very interesting. On the radio, just before we came on here, I heard our good friend Ryan Tubley talking about protocols for Zoom meetings and mistakes he's making when he's on management meetings. There is a lot of practical things. Myself and John, we've had fun with this, John, I think, yeah?
We sure have this virtual world, especially with the different platforms and different client forms to use.
Yeah. And sometimes even the microphones give us challenges. That's the real world we're dealing with, guys. It is all about what are best practices, what are best practical techniques. And there is a wealth of knowledge and experience there. And these are some of the things we want to delve into a little bit deeper as we go forward. So that's what we're hoping to cover. And certainly Creve is going to mention an upcoming program where we can go into this a little bit more depth. But for those who are interested, 2 books, myself and John have done a lot of research on this lately. 2 books that I thought were very timely and really helped my thinking when we did a lot of this research. Leading in the Next Normal, this guy, Michael Anderson, an American author, he did this work just prior to the pandemic. And he published this book just prior to the pandemic, based upon this trend towards remote management. Okay. And I really like some of the themes that came from that. The other book I've been reading, and it only came out again around about the same time, very fresh. Can You Hear Me? I love the title. You know, you're on mute. You know, it's this whole idea of, you know, how to connect with people in a virtual world. I was talking to a business development person yesterday, based for a Sligo manufacturing company. He talked about trying to do business development in a virtual world. It's a whole new game. You know, this is a guy who was an engineer, became business development for an injection molding company. He said, listen, it's a whole new world. And he's still trying to get that formula right. And he recognized, yeah, this is all about new skills, about how to connect with people to do business development. Not without its challenges. There's going to be a whole new game there. Be glad to hear we're coming to the end of this webinar, but really, hopefully what you've gained an idea is in terms of the world has changed and it will change further. And it's really brought to bear in terms of we got to think for your organization and for your team, what's the right mix? Because there will not be one solution. Are we likely to go back to the return to the office, the pre-pandemic model? You probably saw from the polls there, a very small percentage of people thinking that's going to be the model that's going to work. That's going to be a challenge. It's going to be different. And that may depend on the nature of the work. If you're working in retail, yes, you got to be standing there in front of the customer. If you're running a production line or a process, guess what? You've got to be there to be able to attend to it. But automation and artificial intelligence is probably going to change some of those things, even for those industries. Will it be the existing work from home approach we've been working with for the last year? Not likely, because of some of the things we've talked about there. It won't be just as you were this year. It'll be very few organizations will go for a full work from home. It'll be some kind of compromise. It's more than likely going to be one of the next two, a hybrid work from home office, where you may be choosing what days you work in the office and what days you work from home, and whether it's 2 or 3 days, that might be up to discussion. Or it may be, is what some companies are doing, is actually, no, we agree, there are core days. We need you to be in the office Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, or Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, or 2 of those days to get all these collaborative. It's going to be some kind of hybrid like that. Probably the biggest area of concern, though, is, this whole idea of a rethink totally on the structure of the working week, the working day. I think you're going to find this is going to be a really interesting challenge in terms of flexible days, flexible hours. It was kind of coming before pandemic. I think you might find those questions accelerated as you come out of the pandemic. How does that fit in? And John, we've talked about this before.
Yeah, Kieran, I do quite a bit of work with Oracle, and Oracle you're talking about core days, Oracle have core hours.
Yeah.
So some lines of business, you have to be in the office before pre-pandemic, between 10 a.m. and 3 p.m. and it's flexible before, flexible afterwards. So it's an interesting approach.
Yeah, and I think we're going to see variations of that, and probably even in terms of what days you're there. So it's going to get really interesting. What you are seeing is, though, a multitude of technologies coming out to help support, remote working. I've been looking at presentations from Facebook and their new workplace tool. We're all very familiar with Microsoft Teams, hugely popular, or Zoom. But there's other technologies. Facebook coming out with Workplace, Google are coming out with Workspace. A lot of us are familiar with tools like Slack, and we're all used to these. But I guarantee you, in a year from now, there's going to be even more sophisticated software tools to actually try to accommodate and compensate for some of those challenges we talked about. So I'm going to finish up here, and certainly we're going to talk about questions and answers in a minute, but really hopefully in the last hour, what we've talked about here is, just understanding some of the themes, about some of the driving forces towards remote management. There's a lot of driving forces there, and the government sees this coming, and they're going to help try and enable this. So it's coming at us. How we deal with it is going to be the challenge. There are dilemmas and challenges, and that's what we're going to see. It's not all rosy. There are complexities, there are problems, there's difficulties you've highlighted. How do we deal with them? But if there's one thing we need to do regardless, we as people, colleagues, technical leads, managers in organizations, leaders in organizations, we probably need to upskill in terms of how we're going to deal with this. At this stage, I'm going to hand back, and thank you very much indeed.